Someday my prince will come.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about Disney. In my experience, people have two reactions to Disney. It's either a symbol of childhood innocence and happiness and can do no wrong, or it's a symbol of corporate greed, contorting children's minds and can do no right. While I don't promise to say things people agree with, I do promise to do my best to be fair. Coming out in 1937, Snow White was the first feature-length cel animated film. It was an ambitious project of artistic expression and venture capitalism that had many doubtful of its success. Walt Disney's wife Lillian even said that nobody would go to see his stupid dwarf cartoon. All of the marvelous animated films we have today, including those of Japanese origin, owe thanks to the revolutionary success of Snow White at that time. Drawing on concepts from Disney's earlier Silly Symphonies short films, Snow White combines classic storytelling with slapstick humor to create a simple, easily understood film that is appreciated by most people who start watching it. The 1984 horror film Gremlins featured an homage to the film by having even the malicious and alien gremlins fall in love with it.
What are they doing?
They're watching Snow White. And they love it.
A lot of people try to justify Disney's movies' content by saying that because they're adaptations, they couldn't deviate from the source material. However, as I'll point out, there were many changes from the Grimm's fairy tale credited as inspiration to fit the values of 1930s America. The source material itself was heavily altered by the Grimm brothers from the original legend to fit the values of 1812 Germany. Anyone who retells a story to any extent is responsible for the content, and Disney is responsible for their films. The film begins with a pseudo-medieval storybook giving us the prologue. Once upon a time, there lived a lovely little princess named Snow White. Her vain and wicked stepmother, the Queen, feared that someday Snow White's beauty would surpass her own, so she dressed the little princess in rags and forced her to work as a scullery maid. This is more or less the same as the original story, the only revisions being the addition of the scullery maid aspect, which explains how she as a princess could clean for the dwarves, and the removal of the superfluous king element. In the original, there's a king, but he never does anything besides marry the evil queen to set up the premise, so there's really no point in having him in the story. This effectively sets the stage as having a feminine focus. There's another page about the queen's practice of consulting the magic mirror, and then we see it for ourselves. The Queen's design, which Walt Disney referred to as Lady Macbeth meets the Big Bad Wolf, reflects the story's gothic origins with her mature, stately beauty, based on the villainous She Who Must Be Obeyed from the 1935 film She. She essentially conjures a demon through the mirror to ask who the fairest in the land is.
Lips red as the rose, hair black as ebony, skin white as snow.
Snow White.
The monotone masculine voice coming from the mask in the mirror creates a very scary moment, evocative of the devil, and we appreciate that this demonic creature is forced to do her bidding, making the more subdued queen appear powerful and scary. We then see our protagonist scrubbing the steps as she sings to animal admirers. What's most apparent to me is the contrast in age between her and the queen. Whereas the queen derives beauty from maturity, Snow White's beauty comes from her youthfulness. Inspired by actress Seizu Pitts, the theme of valued youth and fear of aging is very overt in the original story and is retained in the Disney version, albeit with a change of age in the Snow White character. In the original story, Snow White is 7. In the film, 14. This marks the main way the story was altered to match the values of 1930s America. Though 14 is below the age of consent in 20th century America, that's easier to hand-wave away as the values of the depicted pseudo-German culture of centuries previous than the more extreme values dissonance of seeing a 7-year-old girl being pursued by a man. I appreciate the change and think it's worth emphasizing that Disney can and does change source material to be sensitive to the values of the modern audience. Snow White sings her desires for her one true love to show up, and conveniently enough, a handsome prince happens to be riding by that very second. The prince, visually based on dancer Louis Hightower, is supposed to be the beautiful counterpart to the beautiful maiden. So what does he do to win over the audience? He climbs right over the fence and approaches her. She freaks out, but we as the audience want her to be open to this prince character and realize that he's the gift that she's been waiting for. Sure, part of that is the extreme simplistic nature of the plot, but there's also the underlying idea that she doesn't have a right to personal boundaries and that the man being so assertive that he violates the boundaries represented by the castle walls should be considered attractive. With different music, this scene could be mistaken for one from a horror film, similar to the part in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows when Aberforth describes the Muggle boys assaulting his sister.
When my sister was 6 years old, she was attacked, set upon by 3 Muggle boys. They'd seen her doing magic, spying through the back garden hedge. She was a kid. She couldn't control it. No witch or wizard can at that age. What they saw scared them, I expect. They forced their way through the hedge, and when she couldn't show them the trick, they got a bit carried away trying to stop the little freak doing it. It destroyed her, what they did. She was never right again.
Unfortunately, this sexist romantic ideal persists today, appearing in such stories as the Stephen Moffat-era Doctor Who. Well, the prince sings to her, and Snow White falls in love with him, because he can sing. It turns out that Betty Everett was wrong. If you want to know if he loves you so, it's not in his kiss, it's in his ability to sing. The queen gets even more jealous, so she gets a huntsman to take Snow White to the woods and carve out her heart. He objects, but she threatens him, and he agrees. He takes her into the woods, where she continues to be obnoxiously cute. He moves to kill her, but he can't bring himself to do it, and he tells her to run and hide in the woods. This is another change. In the original, he couldn't kill her directly, but he would kill her indirectly by surrendering her to nature. In the film, the evil characters are cut down to only the queen and those directly associated with the queen, like the mirror and the buzzards. Snow White runs around the woods and gets terrified by everything. She really is like a little kid, and everyone treats her like one. Though appropriate to the original 7-year-old character, she should have been adapted to a proper 14-year-old. I suspect that her character draws a lot from the sexism of the 1930s. That, at least, is a meme that second-wave feminism managed to do away with for the most part. The terrifying things turn out to be cute little animals, some of which are New World animals that you wouldn't even find in modern Germany. She starts singing again, and they become her bestest friends. The original story had some elements of this, where even harsh nature respects her beauty and mourns her passing, but Disney takes it up to 11. Here, she's so lovely that all sorts of wild animals become tame and cuddly in her presence. It's objectifying, as it makes our lead female be admired primarily for her looks and cute disposition. Snow White asks the animals to take her somewhere where she can sleep, and all of the cute critters lead her to the dwarves' cottage. She sees no one's home and lets herself in, along with all of the animals. She scoffs at the mess and decides to clean, the animals chipping in. Frankly, I'd clean it too if it were that filthy, but I don't like the implication that it's in the nature of womenfolk to clean things, as well as that it's in the nature of menfolk to be dirty. In the original, she cleaned for the dwarves only to earn her keep. While no doubt because of gender roles, it doesn't imply anything about the innate cleanliness of men and women, or at least not to this degree. After cleaning, Snow White falls asleep across 3 dwarves' beds. You know, when she was 7, it made more sense for her to stay with dwarves because she fit their furniture. Meanwhile, the dwarves mine for diamonds until 5 o'clock, and then head home. They get freaked out about having a stranger intrude and clean, and eventually work up the courage to confront them, only to see that it's the harmless Snow White. Well, actually, Grumpy is afraid of her. He's a misogynist who thinks that all women are evil.
And old sourpuss here is Grumpy, the woman hater.
But he's a strawman caricature of a misogynist, there to make misogynists look stupid.
They're full of wicked wiles. What are wicked wiles? I don't know, but I'm agin 'em.
That is a feminist part of the film, and it's the main reason why it's wrong to dismiss it as pure anti-feminism. It has many facets equally deserving of acknowledgement. She explains why she's there and asks to stay. Most are accepting, but Grumpy scares everyone by talking about what the Queen is rumored to be capable of, and how they shouldn't make her an enemy of theirs. To persuade them, she offers to serve them as a maid and cook. While I can appreciate their making a deal of mutual benefit playing to their strengths, this also really plays up the idea that this is how men and women should naturally interact. The dwarves are then essentially independent bachelors who are tamed by a wife figure and are induced to better themselves through conforming to the role of husband in a stable household, being made to clean themselves before dinner. Grumpy acts as a straw misogynist, presenting the idea that a good husband shouldn't be worried about having a domineering wife and should want to better himself. A deleted scene would have continued on this theme by having the dwarves have to learn how to eat like gentlemen. Meanwhile, the evil queen doesn't eat the heart like she does in the original story, preferring to instead hold it in a chest. She goes to the mirror to ask again who the fairest in the land is, learns of Snow White, and goes to kill her herself. That a woman should be pitted against a girl makes the narrative of feminist interest, and it is notable that the queen takes such an active role in the plot. In the original story, she is a master of disguise who uses her cosmetics for evil. Here she is a witch who uses her powers to physically transform into an ugly old woman, representing the ugliness of herself that she fears while Snow White lives. Both versions of this evil, the cosmetics and the witch, represent the evils of femininity, as is often depicted in this misogynistic world. In the original story, she tries 3 times to kill Snow White through presenting her with dangerous wares, representing female sexuality as part of a message about the value of virginity. In the film, she tries once with an apple that has its sexual imagery removed. There is no references to blushing and breasts as there is with the original. She reviews her spellbook, which says that the curse of sleeping death can only be broken by love's first kiss, which she scoffs at even though she's aware of the prince, because she mistakenly believes that the dwarves are sensible people who would bury Snow White, instead of putting her on display. The sleeping death thing is a change from the original story, as the authors didn't seem to understand what death was, and called simple unconsciousness death. So it makes sense to invoke a sort of magical coma to the more knowledgeable audience of the 1930s. Back at the cottage, the dwarves have a party to celebrate Snow White staying with them. After everyone gets tired, Snow White sings about her prince one day coming for her. The song, "Someday My Prince Will Come," has extreme social significance in American culture and can be used to symbolize the idea that all women are waiting for a man to come into their lives and rescue them from hardship through marriage. This makes it problematic from a modern perspective, both in and out of the fictional universe. I've seen justification that it's really about Snow White wanting someone to rescue her from the queen, and marriage to someone from a foreign nation being the best way to do that. But that kind of utility is not what people get out of this song, nor is it what I think the creators intended. It's supposed to be a romantic ballad. The dwarves give her their beds and sleep in various non-beds throughout the house. While that is proper manners, I don't like how they put her on such a pedestal just for being pretty and having other superficial womanly qualities. And Snow White prays that Grumpy would like her, and Grumpy overhears. The next day, the dwarves leave for work and warn Snow White not to open the door for strangers. In the original story, the queen represented harmful sexuality to corrupt the innocent maiden, but in the film it's been shifted to simply stranger danger, which I think is an acceptable version. Snow White kisses each of the dwarves goodbye, and they absolutely love this. Even Grumpy likes the attention, though he won't admit to it. Keeping in mind that as silly as they act, these are actually full-grown men with long white beards, I'm inclined to interpret this less as a wholesome father-daughter kind of scene and more of a creepy Bob Barker kind of scene.
This little fellow is bashful. He's secretly in love with Snow White.
Goodbye.
Oh, God.
Creepy.
Okay, I'll make an exception for Dopey, as he clearly has some kind of mental problem that makes him like a little kid, but that makes 6 Creepers beloved by America. People buy dolls of these characters for their kids. Snow White reprises "Someday My Prince Will Come" as she makes Grumpy a pie in an American style, not a German style. I have some concerns about her trying to charm Grumpy like this. In usual circumstances, it's probably wise to try to make friends with grumpy people by being nice to them, but because Grumpy the dwarf has demonstrated actual misogyny, it's a bit problematic to look to the woman to charm him. The other dwarves should take him aside and try to talk sense into him. There's a difference between being grumpy and being hateful, and I don't like how hate is equated with simple grumpiness. And the fact that a bunch of birds that are never shown washing contribute to the cooking doesn't make it any less of Snow White's project. The queen suddenly shows up and terrifies the kids in the audience. The ugliness of her old hag persona is used to communicate that she's evil, which has a bad message equating beauty with morality. It's weird because she's the second fairest in the land in her normal form, and still clearly evil, but her old hag ugliness is used to make her fearsome, and in contrast to the wholesome Snow White. It feels like the spell reveals the ugliness of her soul or something. It demonizes old women and plays into the whole objectification of Snow White as this perfect, beautiful girl. The animals rush to get the dwarves, with Grumpy being the one to take charge and lead a rescue, thus completing his character development. But they're too late. The queen tricks Snow White into taking a bite because she says it's a magic wishing apple and reminds her of the prince, and Snow White wishes for a happily ever after. The queen laughs triumphantly about being the fairest in the land, but the dwarves arrive and chase her to a mountain, where a Deus Ex Machina lightning bolt both has her tumbling off a cliff and crushed by a boulder, and then eaten by buzzards. There's then the most depressing sequence ever, where all of the dwarves mourn her, even Grumpy, and then all the cute fuzzy wuzzies. As the black letter epilogue tells us, Snow White is so beautiful that the dwarves can't find it in their hearts to bury her, and put her in a fancy glass coffin. Just think about that for a moment. A dead girl is so pretty that they put her on display. She's technically in a magical coma, but the dwarves don't know that. It's bizarre objectification. And then the prince comes into play to prove Betty Everett right in the end. While I guess in universe he's in love with her, what kind of love is that? He heard pretty singing, jumped over the wall, liked her looks, and sang to her. That is the entire extent of their relationship. While it's noble for him to want to save her from dire circumstances, that is not the basis for a healthy relationship. After some time, which might be months or even years later, he hears of the maiden in the glass coffin, and he kisses her while the dwarves and animals give their assent. Yeah, it's the thing that breaks the spell, but no one here knows that. It's purely objectification. The woman's mind doesn't even need to be there for a romantic kiss just because the body's pretty. I'm forgiving of necrophilia under circumstances of extreme trauma on the battlefield, where soldiers suffering from PTSD will sometimes make out and have sex with their deceased comrades. Yes, this happens. But the prince is in a rational state of mind, and this should not be acceptable. And as for love's first kiss, Disney removed a lot of the sexual messages of the original story, but there's still this glorification of virginity. Snow White and the prince couldn't have kissed at all for this to work. They couldn't have had an actual romantic relationship, making the comatose kissing cure non-consensual by definition. And non-consent really defines their relationship, with the prince just throwing himself over the wall. These are romantic ideals of another age, and they are really problematic. You have to keep in mind the film's context. It came out in 1937, when feminism was still relatively young. The feminine mystique wouldn't come out for 30 years, and it was still legal for a man to rape his wife, but women had obtained the vote. The presence of Grumpy means that this likely would have been considered feminist from a first-wave perspective. The film appeals to the standard ethics of the time, which are thoroughly sexist from a modern standpoint, but are vast improvements from the original material from the Middle Ages. I really can't blame Walt Disney for producing a product of his time period, but the narrative gains new context for being this beloved fairy tale of the modern era. While I don't think modern people can watch a production of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew without thinking, even though Shakespeare's a genius, this is sexist as hell. People tend to overlook Disney because of nostalgia for their childhoods and the belief that all things Disney are things of innocent beauty, appropriate to pass on to their own kids, somehow managing to forget that they can't pick up a copy of Song of the South for some reason. On the other hand, I don't like to demonize Disney. Chernabog wasn't Walt's lord and master, but rather he was a businessman out to make a profit. Though people like to equate the two, it must not be forgotten that this was something he couldn't do without appealing to the people. Disney's successes are a reflection of the audiences of their eras. When I say that Snow White is sexist, I'm also indirectly speaking of the Americans of 1937. As it is still this beloved classic, modern audiences are also sexist in that they're willing to ignore such aspects. With The Taming of the Shrew, there's a sense of people appreciating the good in spite of the bad. But with Snow White, there's often a sense of people painting it with a broad stroke of, this is Disney, it's good for kids, and forgetting the historical context. The race politics are also worth comment. The beauty ideals of Snow White are based entirely on the premise that white skin is perfection. Thus all this focus on Snow White having skin as white as snow. The evil queen is also pale in her beauty. The adjective for beauty she keeps using is fair. The film the Queen's character design pays homage to, She, is an incredibly racist film itself. In his notes for Snow White, he describes an action the dwarves take using the N-word. I think he should be considered racist even if he wasn't a Klansman, the same way that any modern white person would be racist for making racist comments, regardless of if they have black friends or not. You can like a person's body of work while still recognizing him and his works as flawed. And that's a sentiment that extends to the entire practice of socio-political analysis. As Anita Sarkeesian puts it,
remember that it's both possible, and even necessary, to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects.